I want to see if you know what I'm talking about when I ask this question. Are you all acquainted with the Congregational Church in Newport? Are you? Are you? Well, you just drive right straight to Newport, and there on your right, just before you get downtown, is an enormous brick building with a beautiful white tower. Excuse me just a moment.
It's similar to Peterborough. They know Peterborough better than Newport.
Peterborough, Hancock.
Hancock. Marlboro.
There are, here's a list of names. I mean, see if you're familiar with them. With the Congregational Church, Ackworth.
Yeah.
Ackworth.
We renovated that.
Pardon me?
Peter was there when they renovated it.
Peter, yes, of course. Hancock, Newport, Webster, Gilmanton, Haverhill, Lebanon, Wentworth, Dover. That list of buildings, of congregational churches, looking somewhat extravagant as compared with a boxy, square, towerless, spireless meeting house. All those congregational churches in the towns I just read were built in the 1820s. Ackworth, 1820, Hancock, 1820, Newport, 1823, Webster, 1823, Gilmanton, 1826, Haverhill, 1827, Lebanon, 1828, Wentworth, 1828, Dover, 1829. It's extraordinary. A dozen churches on a new architectural style, because the thing about these churches is they're not meeting houses. They all have their entry on the gable end, not on the south side. Every meeting house built for 50 years before had its entry on the south side, its pulpit high up on the north side. These new ones had their entry on the gable end and the pulpit at the far end. And at least in most cases, I haven't been in every last one of these. But the idea is that people started saying, why don't we worship in a church instead of a meeting house? And so what you have, starting in the 1820s, culminating in 1840, is new churches being built that are called churches, although the term meeting house doesn't just disappear by a long means, but we think of them now as churches. We would never call most of these meeting houses. But these new churches inspired, I believe, and here you're being speculative as an historian, because you don't know for sure what's going on in people's minds, but it would appear that these new churches built by professional architects who were trained in Boston and who were looking toward Bullfinch for models, these new churches were a kind of inspiration for a building program of congregational churches. And not only congregational, because it's only at this time, after the 1820s. See, now I think it's remarkable, incidentally, that all of these expensive-looking churches, genuinely advanced, modern-looking churches, were built within a decade after the Toleration Act removed government support from them. So some of the communities were affluent, but the smaller communities were the ones where there was financial difficulty. The 20s also saw the beginning of what burgeoned in the next decade, in the 1830s, namely new white small churches like the church, like this one in some respects, but more like, let's say, the Congregational Church in Washington. a small church, that one was built in 1840. A small white steepled church, always a steeple of some sort, always smaller than a meeting house, always with the entry on the gable end, always facing the road. That's become a stereotype. And now, another big piece of news for 1830, painted white. All of these wooden churches that dot, there are hundreds of them, and they're not just congregational, that dot the countryside, all of them started appearing in the 1820s, late 1820s, and especially in the 1830s and 40s. So we've got these genuine fancy churches like Newport and Hancock. You've got these smaller white churches. Some of the big ones were brick. The smaller ones were almost never brick. These white, because suddenly it becomes, there's enough prosperity around to create white paint, which needs white lead, and which is very good paint. And it's only about 1830 that we begin seeing these New Hampshire villages with the little church in the Vale painted white and with the steeple. We think of that as being historical New England. Well, it is historical if by that you mean 1830, but it's not historical if by that you mean the colonial era. There were not small colonial churches like that. They came about when it became possible for people to imagine a different form of worship. And one of the conditions of that reimagining of worship was the Toleration Act, but not the only thing. The fact that there was more affluence with another contextual fact. The third thing that happened, and which culminated in 1840, is slightly more complicated, but I think even more interesting. Because we have all these meeting houses in New Hampshire, these congregational meeting houses, hundreds of them. So what's going to happen to them? Well, they're sort of worn out. There was a kind of crisis in the life of the New Hampshire meeting house around 1840. What are you going to do with it? In fact, if the church now moves out of the meeting house and builds its own little white church and paints a little church and paints it white, because that's the style now, what's going to happen to the meeting house, which is now devolves to the town? Many churches were wise enough to think, we as a church, now not supported by government, don't want to have the obligation of paying for the upkeep of this old meeting house. So they moved out, built their own church. So meeting houses began disintegrating and falling apart all over the place. Or they were sold or moved. And in the next century, we don't even know what happened to them. For example, in Antrim, do you know exactly what happened to your original meeting house, which was built on the same style as the one in Washington? But in any case, what we have is people still worshiping in these meeting houses that had, some of which had been kept in good repair. And now, if the church is going to stay in that old meeting house, how can we make it more church-like? Because that square box with that high pulpit and those box pews and those galleries, this unheated space, maybe our grandparents thought it was wonderful, but we think it's pretty boring and pretty crude and pretty terrible. And in particular, we can't stand to be preached to from somebody that's 16 feet above us. So what are we going to do? Well, 14, now that's not a large number, but 14. One of the pieces of research I did helped me to discover that there are about 14 or 15 of these meeting houses that were totally transformed into churches rather like, or as much like as possible, these Newport, Hancock-like real churches. So here's what happened in, I'll read you the list of the towns. Well, I'll read it to you first. If you know the Congregational Church in these towns, Newington, off on the coast, Greenland, East Derry, Amherst, Chester, Rochester, Keene, Hopkinton, Salisbury, Rindge, Andover, Exeter, East Alsted. The congregational church in each of those towns is a renovated version of a meeting house which was once identical. All of these were identical to each other, except for trim and various small features. But structurally, architecturally, they were the same. Now, what has happened was this: in all of these churches, all of these meeting houses, congregation during the 1830s did the following. If it was facing any direction other than, if it was facing south to the side, they turned it so that the gable end was facing south, and they created an entry on the gable end. You find this hard to believe, but I'm going to give you a stunning example. You know the church, Congregational Church in Keene. In Keene, right there on the square with an enormous tower. It looks like it was built as a real church. Well, it wasn't. It was built exactly the same way the meeting house in Washington was built. The meeting house in Washington minus the tower, that was added later. Inside that Keene church is a wooden frame meeting house that is exactly like all of these other meeting houses were. It's all been added. It's been twice turned. Twice it was turned in Keene. The whole front has been added. The entrance once was on the south side, what is now the east side, but it was turned, and the entrance is now on the gable end. It's a stunning example of what was done architecturally in the 1830s. You're aware of the church in Hopkinton. You just drive right through the center of Hopkinton, and if you're coming this way, then it's on your right, and the entrance is on the south gable end, not the way it was built. That was built, turned 90 degrees, and the entrance was on the south, and it was a double door with a high pulpit. Now its entrance is on the gable end, and it's got a new steeple and a new entrance, totally. What was done to these 15 congregational churches was to create a new entry on the end, sometimes with a steeple or a tower or whatever, usually with a steeple and a tower, and also perhaps an entry area that was just added to the front. 6 or 7 of them were switched around, were changed, such as Keene's and Hopkinson's were. That is, I mean turned, I mean jacked up, and 50 yoke of oxen cradled the thing around. What happened at places like Keene and Hopkinton and all these others was this. They created that new entrance, but inside they also did something very simple. They all removed the box pews, which were all standard, took them all out, replaced them with regular pews, took the pulpit, which had been on the side, and created a pulpit on the end, on the far end, so you enter in the rear, and the pulpit is on the far end. They made those fundamental changes, and what's interesting, I find it very interesting, that the changes were all the same. New entrance on gable end with a new facade, lowering the pulpit, putting it on the end, so moving it from where it was and putting it elsewhere, and removing the box pews and replacing them with regular familiar pews. Now, that's an extraordinary thing to have happened. These were people and communities, 15 of them, that really wanted to maintain their historical church, the church of their grandfathers and grandmothers. But we're affluent enough at this time to be able to afford to completely renovate it, but nevertheless save it. In 5 of these cases, the building was raised and a new ground floor was put in underneath. And in, I think, 4 of them, the town and the church now still work in that renovated meeting house with the town on the lower floor and the church on the upper floor. I'm not going to go into the complications of what happened in Ackworth, because Ackworth is a kind of special thing.
Does that have anything to do with Reverend Howe? Or?
The Howes will be able to tell you what has happened there, but that church too was raised, but it was not built as a meeting house as these others were. It was built as what it is, a magnificent church. But anyway, this is my view of what was important at certain moments. It's not possible to say that one of these things, that is what happened in 1800, that it alone led to what happened in 1819, namely the Toleration Act, or that the Toleration Act all by itself sponsored and prompted the architectural explosion. Other things were part of the picture, of course, but these things